Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience in holding, and welcome to the Municipal Liquidity Facility drop-in discussion. At this time, all of your participant phone lines are in a listen-only mode, and later there'll be an opportunity for your questions. If you'd like to queue up for a question today, feel free at any moment to press 1 followed by 0 on your phone. Just a reminder, today's conference is being recorded. Now happy to turn the conference over to First Vice President at the New York Fed, Michael Strine.
Good afternoon, and thanks for your time and joining the call. Michael Strine, as our host suggested, I'm the First Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That's my day job. Recently, I was given an assignment to be the executive that is accountable for the Municipal Liquidity Facility. The goals for the call today, the Municipal Liquidity Facility affects states, counties, and cities across the country with their cash flow needs. Governments are under tremendous stress as a result of the virus, as is the municipal securities market. We recognize that you have strong relationships with government leaders in your district and are likely to get inquiries regarding this program. We've provided you the term sheet and FAQs. There's a dedicated website for the facility. They are the best source of information for a broad overview. If you haven't already read them, I'd encourage you to do so, and if possible, to pull them up so you have them in front of you now. I'm going to introduce a few of the key players so you know who is doing what and have some point of reference for who you might reach out to. And we hope to provide a resource for you to direct questions that you and those in your district might have about the program. We will monitor and respond to those questions, either with general statements and FAQs for the common programs or directed follow-ups on specific questions if they are necessary. People you ought to know that are involved in this program, President Rob Kaplan and President John Williams are serving as executive advisors to me and to the program more generally. Matt Lieber of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York Markets Group has been working closely on the policy issues with the Board of Governors, and specifically on issues like market monitoring and pricing and the secondary market. And Rashid Nassim, who is also the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, who is leading the New York Bank's operations and execution team for this program as the selected bank to run this facility. We've been fortunate to be supported by a cast of dozens from Board Legal and New York Legal, from research and policy staff at the Board, New York, and other reserve banks across the system. We have key vendors that we've put in place with a depth of muni experience, whether it's outside counsel and administrative agent, custodians and transaction agents that are on the way, in large part because municipal securities is not an area in which the Federal Reserve typically operates. Last but not least, I want to introduce to you my co-host for this, Kent Heitschuh. Kent joined the Federal Reserve Board 5 weeks ago at the request of the chair and other governors. Kent was the first director of the Treasury's Office of State and Local Financing, and he dealt with the Puerto Rican debt crisis recently and the Obama administration's Build America Infrastructure Financing Program. With over 30 years of prior experience in public finance in major Wall Street firms, Kent brings tremendous gifts to our program in terms of experience, insight, creativity, and commitment to helping the Fed deliver on the important objectives of this program, given that this is an area we haven't traditionally operated. Our goals are to help inform you on the program, to solicit your help in us achieving our objectives by exercising that knowledge with the key relationships you have, and to partner together to provide the support to the states, counties, and cities that this program is designed to serve. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kent to provide a broad overview. We promise to leave sufficient time to answer the questions you have, and so we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks again.
Thanks, Michael. I'll just give a quick overview of kind of where we've gotten to this point, and then I will walk through the FAQs that were issued earlier this week. As most of you know, the municipal securities market has been under considerable strain recently, beginning in early to mid-March. While we saw dramatic increases in sales by institutional investors, particularly at mutual funds as a result of redemption requests from retail investors raising cash. This caused a swift and dramatic increase in interest rates on municipal securities, with the worst of the market probably being in the last week of March. Although rates have come down from their highs and some issuers have been able to issue debt or secure loans, there are still many issuers that are struggling to meet their financing needs through the capital markets. And, of course, at the same time, given this unprecedented event, the impact on states, cities, and counties in terms of their liquidity has been dramatic, with not only higher costs with regard to the pandemic, but first the delay in income tax receipts to July, and now certainly there will be significant declines in certain tax revenues, primarily income and sales, as a result of the sharp recession that we're experiencing. So on April 9th, as I think you all know, the Fed announced the Municipal Liquidity Facility. It's designed to enhance liquidity in the primary short-term markets through the purchase directly from issuers of a variety of different kinds of short-term instruments that municipalities and states often issue that will provide them access to liquidity. That facility was announced on April 9th in terms of the issuing a term sheet. We received a significant amount of comment through the portal on the Federal Reserve Board website. We continue to refine our policy, and this week we issued a revised term sheet together with the FAQs that I'm going to walk through. So how will the MLF work? We're using the Fed's 13.3 authorities together with the funding from the CARES Act of Section 4027, a contribution by the Treasury of $35 billion to the SPV is able to be leveraged to the point of having the capacity to purchase up to $500 billion of eligible notes. The program will be up and operating as soon as possible. We'll talk about that at the end of the call. And it will run through December 31st, the calendar year end, unless extended in agreement between the board and the Treasury Department. So once we're up and operating and the window is open, we will be able to purchase securities presented to us by eligible issuers between that point and the end of the year. I'm going to jump to Section B now and deal with some very fundamental questions that everybody is asking us, and we'd welcome your questions afterwards. Many of you know that the municipal market is comprised of over 50,000 issuers of everybody from states, large cities and counties, all the way to villages and townships, and a whole variety of districts, authorities, enterprise agencies, and so forth. And so our primary objective is trying to get to the biggest needs as quickly as we can, and at the same time support the market so that it will function again, both the capital markets and particularly in the note field. We typically see a fair amount of regional and national money center banks that purchase notes. So without being able to serve every potential issuer in the marketplace, our goal is to try to address the largest needs and provide for what we're going to talk about as downstreaming to others, but also to encourage the private investors in the municipal market to once again be purchasing paper for liquidity purposes. So an eligible issuer is a state, city, or county or they can use an entity that issues on their behalf, because there's oftentimes limitations on city, states, and counties directly issuing debt, or what we'll define in a second as a multi-state entity that can come to the window directly. The threshold rating requirement is that as of the date of the program, the issuers had to be BBB investment grade, minimum by 2 rating agencies. And we will be pricing these securities when they come to the window based on their rating at the time, and there is a fallen angels provision so that we can finance as low as BB minus Baa3, although there is only one institution, one government entity that we know of within the eligible amounts that are below BBB at this point. A multi-state entity has to have a little bit higher ratings in the A category because they are revenue bond issuers. They don't have sovereign status or taxing powers, and their rating can fall as low as investment grade and still qualify at the time of selling the notes to us. Most importantly, the initial program targeted the 50 states, D.C., and populations for cities of over 1 million and counties of over 2 million. That has been significantly reduced to 250,000 and 500,000 respectively. This results in 261 eligible issuers by our count that can directly come to the Fed for this funding facility. A multi-state entity is eligible if they were approved through a compact with the U.S. Congress. There are many, many of these, but only about 8 or so that issue debt. The biggest example would be the Port Authority here in New York. There are various bridge and port facilities that cross the Delaware River between New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Delaware that would qualify. The D.C. Metro in Washington qualifies under this definition, as does a bi-state commission in St. Louis that spans the Mississippi River. The list of eligible issuers is in Appendix A that is part of the FAQ, so I encourage you to look at that. The next 2 definitions I'm going to skip over, except for explaining this downstreaming that we're encouraging. In order to be more efficient and get funding out there, we're encouraging states, cities, or counties who are eligible to use the proceeds to the extent that they can under their constitutions, their statutes, and their credit capacity to purchase the notes of smaller entities that are not eligible or authorities. And so B2 and B3 simply describe the difference between an entity that's authorized to issue on behalf of a state, city, or county and an entity who could benefit from the downstreaming of the funds. B4 is very important. We've gotten a lot of questions about this. While we're encouraging the use of proceeds to be downstreamed to the extent possible, the credit that the Fed will face is of the eligible issuer. And so the eligible issuer has to be in a position to guarantee the performance of the political subdivision or entity that they are lending the money to. Let's talk about the eligible notes. What is an eligible note? It's, as I described before, standard tax anticipation notes, tax and revenue anticipation notes, or bond anticipation notes, or other similar short-term notes that are commonly issued in the municipal market and will take maturities of up to 36 months from the date of issuance. These notes are all for the purpose of providing liquidity so that state and local governments can manage their cash flow through this unprecedented, stressful time from the fiscal impact of the pandemic. C3, we talk about the proceeds. Again, this is to meet the cash flow needs of the eligible issuers or those of their political subdivisions or entities that they want to downstream to. We've also provided for the ability to use these proceeds to pay maturing principal and interest on other obligations that may be coming due as a way to, again, try to better manage through the cash flow stress that many of these entities are facing. I won't go into detail about the security, but the security is obviously very important. We're leaning on the existing infrastructure within the municipal industry in terms of the typical way that a state, city, or county would borrow, and we're looking for the strongest credit that they typically use. The first level would be a general obligation of that issuer, but we are very familiar with the legal constraints that certain entities operate in terms of being able to pledge their GO. There may be a constitutional limitation. There may be a need to gain voter approval. And so we're providing other alternatives, but in all cases, it must represent a pledge of the credit of the state, city, or county that is borrowing the funds. Multi-state entities, as I said earlier, don't have taxing power, but in that case, we would be looking for a parity lien, a parity senior lien on the principal sources of their revenues as security. And so, for example, the Port Authority has $20 billion of debt outstanding. They're rated AA, AA minus by the rating agencies. If they were going to come to our window, we would expect to have a parity lien on the same credit that supports their outstanding debt. We talked about the minimum rating to qualify, but then there's going to be a rating that will enable us to price the securities. We will have a pricing grid that will be public and applied uniformly across all the credits that are similarly rated and that have a similar maturity. And so C5 simply describes the need to confirm the outstanding ratings so that we can then apply the grid to that rating category. Of course, as with all 13.3 facilities, we need to develop a pricing grid that will comply with our obligation to establish the pricing at a penalty rate that's a premium to normalized conditions, but that also meets our goal of providing credit under exigent circumstances. And so we're in the process of developing that. We'll talk about next steps, but we would anticipate that this pricing formula will be released to the marketplace relatively soon, hopefully within a week, perhaps a little longer, but our goal is to get it out next week. Interest on the notes typically with these kinds of securities are due at maturity, but we provide flexibility in terms of when that interest payment will be due, more frequently or say semi-annually, which is often the case in the municipal market, or at maturity. These notes will be able to be purchased using either a tax-exempt or a taxable rate, depending on the use of proceeds. The notes will be eligible to be repurchased by the issuer at any time, in whole or in part, and at par or the amortized premium, whatever, depending on the coupon that's provided. And it's important for the issuers to know that this extension of credit is only through the 13.3 sort of exigent circumstances window that the Fed and the Treasury have approved. So right now, it's only through December 31st. So issuers should not anticipate rolling these maturities to the extent they're shorter than 3 years, but rather when they come due, they will either be paid off with the revenues that have been pledged in the form of a trans or a RANS, or by selling debt into the long-term capital markets or short-term capital markets to pay the maturity, the maturing principal of the bond anticipation notes. There is a formula by which we established how much capacity or eligibility there is for selling notes to the Fed, and it's roughly equal to 20% of an annual revenue for the respective state, city, county, or multi-state entity. So it's a significant amount of money. The aggregate of the 261 does not total 500, so there is excess capacity that should additional liquidity be needed, especially for downstreaming, that a state, city, or county can apply once it's exhausted its initial allocation for additional capacity. We don't anticipate that happening very quickly, but we do have that capacity. The fee for this facility is 10 basis points payable at the time of the borrowing based on the par amount outstanding. I think that's pretty much it. We're going to have standard legal opinions, disclosure requirements, and various certificates that will have to be delivered in order to qualify for the program. In short, we're leaning on the existing infrastructure of the municipal bond market for issuers, their bond counsel, their financial advisors, to do what they always do in order to borrow into the capital markets, but to provide a backstop to ensure that they have access to liquidity at reasonable interest rates to manage their cash flows through this extremely stressful period. And we hope that by making that liquidity available will both encourage the municipal market to be lending again at such reasonable levels, but also to give confidence to the municipal market that from a credit perspective, issuers will not be confronted with liquidity shortages during this period. So, Michael, with that, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Kent. Very helpful and very clear. I would just add a couple of items that have come up in questions. As Kent says, we're getting a lot of feedback from states, counties, and municipalities or cities. We're getting other feedback through various sources, so I'll address proactively some questions that have come up. One is in light of the Paycheck Protection Program and some of the issues that occurred where people were competing to get access to the facility. This facility is not a first-come, first-served facility. There is actually a fixed allocation of 20% of the revenues, and so there is sufficient capacity in the facility that states, counties, and cities that want to come through this program don't need to feel like they need to rush in the door in order to get access to these, and so we're able to fully support them. Second question you might have is, when is this thing going to be up and running? As Ken suggested, our goal is to get a second set of FAQs out in short order that would address the issues like pricing and the process that we will use to issue or to purchase securities from issuers. The goal is for us to be able to do issuance in the month of May, by the end of May, but simultaneously, so we want speed to market, but simultaneously we have to build an operating process that will support 261 issuers' needs getting through this program by the end of December. And so that's an important balance we're trying to strike. One other thing that has come up is what happens at the end of the 36 months if a state, county, or municipality can't afford to pay their debt. This is not a grant program, and as many of you have read, actors in Washington, Congress, and the President are discussing the needs of states, counties, and cities with respect to help and through a grant program. We would not anticipate rolling this over or doing a program that would extend beyond the 36-month life. This, the objective, as Kent suggested, is to provide short-term liquidity to provide a bridge for these entities to get to the other side. And with that, I will stop and ask for questions from the audience.
Ladies and gentlemen, just a reminder, if you'd like to queue up here for questions this afternoon, feel free to press 1 followed by 0 immediately. If you are using a speakerphone, it may be helpful to lift the handset before pressing those number keys. But once again, to queue up here for question immediately, press 1 followed by 0. It may be just a brief moment. At this time, it actually looks like we have no one queuing by phone.
Michael, would it be useful just to talk about our objective of making sure that the full regional bank network is talking to and taking questions from issuers and how they might proceed from that point in terms of getting those questions answered?
Yes, thank you. So we anticipate, as I suggested in the introduction, that because you have relationships with congressional officials or with governors and their executive staffs or with county executives and their staffs or with mayors and their staffs, you will get questions from the community. We've established an inbox. It is MLF, all caps, at ny.frb.org. If you use that, that is one vehicle of submitting questions that would enable us to then triage them, and we commit to you getting back to you in a timely way. We've got a lot going on to get this program stood up, and that's the most efficient way for us to support you. And we'll gather up those questions, and those that are more generally applicable, we will share back with everyone. And as I suggested, where you have a specific situational question, we will try to address that and give you a direct phone call back. One question I did receive in advance that came from some from the legislative affairs areas were, what do we do with states? Examples were West Virginia or Idaho, where there are few cities or counties that meet the population criteria. Kent addressed this directly, but I'm going to reemphasize it. It includes a provision that allows states to downstream their capacity to support the needs of counties and cities within their jurisdictions. Kent and I are already aware, based on our contacts across the country, and Kent has done a lot of this work, where states are working cooperatively with the entities within their jurisdiction to become aware of their needs and to begin to build in anticipation of this program becoming available. So that is the mechanism for cities below those thresholds or counties below those thresholds to still have access. And the second mechanism is that, as Ken suggested, as we begin to establish backstop pricing and we begin to do our own work in this area, our hope is that municipal markets more broadly improve and that there would be more direct access for those counties and cities that don't meet the population thresholds.
We do now have questions queued by phone.
Okay.
Looks like the first is from Javier Silva of New York Fed Bank. Your line is open.
Oh, hi, Michael. Just listening to your response, the answer I had was already answered. The question I had is already addressed. Thank you.
Next, we have the line of Leslie McGranahan, the Chicago Fed. Your line is open.
I think I had a similar question, but I was thinking in particular of something like a regional transit authority that kind of goes across city boundaries. Would they have to go through the state, or could they go through the city? So do they have to be a subsidiary, a full subsidiary of the government that's going to the window on their behalf?
So, again, we're designing a program that we're making available to states, cities, and counties, and they will need to use their local law to figure out the best way to utilize the program. So we can't anticipate every arrangement with different regional transit authorities or any other kinds of authorities. I know in New York City, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority is a state entity, but they're talking to both the state and the city, each of whom are eligible issuers, on how the funds can be downstreamed. If you're talking about RTA in Chicago, that's an interesting one because they're not really an operating entity like CTA is. They generally bond for capital using a sales tax. So I don't know if RTA would be the entity that would need funding, or CTA, or one of the other operating lines, but they would have to work with the state and the city to figure out the best way to get funding to either the RTA, who would then send it to CTA, or directly to those entities. But essentially, we've designed a program that we hope is flexible, but we're not in a position of changing or influencing how the states and the cities figure out how to utilize the funding. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that gets at it.
Thank you.
It looks like next we have the line of Casey Lozer of the Minneapolis Fed. Your line is open.
Hello, this is Casey Lozer. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. So I have a question about the eligible issuers, and I'm wondering if there's been any consideration for incorporating tribes or tribal governments who are unique political jurisdictions with unique credit needs into the MLF.
Yes, I mean, the tribes are something that we've looked at. They have not only unique needs, but they have unique credit structures. That is an area that we are continuing to evaluate, but it's a very challenging category of borrower to interface with, given their legal structures, their lack of any investment-grade ratings in large part. And so we're talking to Treasury, we're talking to Congress, and their needs may not be able to be met by a facility that's created pursuant to our 13.3 obligations and requirements.
And I would just build on that to say the same question has come up with respect to territories. And there are other means by which policymakers may choose to address the territory and tribe financial dislocations.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I just want to offer any assistance. I'm the director of the Center for Indian Country Development at the Minneapolis Fed, and if I can be of any assistance working with tribes on this, please let me know.
That's a very
helpful.
welcome offer. Thank you.
Yep.
And that's exactly one of the reasons we were convening this call, is because all of you can be very helpful to us, and we appreciate the offers of help.
Thank you.
Next, we have the line of Adam Hilly Before we open, just a reminder, 1-0, if you'd like to queue up here for a question. And next is Adam Hilly, Fed of San Francisco. Your line is now open for us.
Well, good afternoon, Kent and Michael. Thanks so much for convening this call. It's been very helpful. And Casey actually beat me to the punch. I had a similar question about the access of tribal governments to the facility. So you already answered that, but please add me to the list as you guys continue these conversations. We'd be very interested to participate in those conversations. So thanks again for holding this important call.
Thanks for your help, Adam. I'm sure we'll be talking more about your great state of California.
Great, and several others.
Next in queue, we have the line of Steve Sharp from the Board of Governors. The line is open.
Hi, Steve Sharp from the Federal Reserve Board. Thank you for taking my question. I was interested to know how you would be factoring in the taxable versus non-taxable status of a security in terms of for pricing or for setting interest rates.
That's a good question. That's not final yet, but just as a general matter, you may know that in taxable munis generally have a relationship between the tax-exempt munis that is based off of the top federal marginal income tax rate. So if you took 1 minus the top rate and divided that into the muni rate, you'd have something equivalent to a taxable. We're doing that kind of analysis now so that there will be an appropriate spread between a tax-exempt rate and a taxable rate.
Okay, that makes sense.
One issue that probably some are concerned about, we have talked about what uses we might not want to see in this program. And an example of one is a new capital project. And another example that got raised by the taxable, tax-exempt question was what would happen with an entity if they didn't handle the tax-exempt status at the front end of the process and we got to the back end and they wanted to refinance it. So that is an issue that has come up. I'm just raising awareness it has, because in case it does come up in context that you make, you can refer them to us and we can probably help with some answers to those kinds of questions.
But I would just say that the program is doing nothing to change the way state and local governments issue their debt, and if they want to issue their debt pursuant to an opinion of tax counsel that it qualifies as tax exemption, that's fine, and we'll have a rate for that. And if they, for whatever reason, can't or don't want to comply with the tax code, we'll have a taxable rate, which is the same as the muni market is. The muni market is, I'm guessing, 90% tax exempt, but there is, an active taxable market for issuers that need borrowing that doesn't otherwise comply with the tax code. I would say that general approach applies across the municipal issuance process. So we're planning on having issuers do what they normally do to issue this debt. They have to get city council approval, state legislature approval. It has to be consistent with their constitutions and their statutes. And we are counting on that process working the way it's worked for decades, the same way the muni market produces about $400 billion, $450 billion of new issuance a year. But we're limiting this to the 3-year maturity to focus on the immediate liquidity needs of state and local governments so they can manage their cash flows with less stress through this period.
One other important value of us relying on the way states, counties, and cities traditionally issue is not only does that make it easier for them because it's their process, but one of the other things is that most of these states, counties, and municipalities have established relationship with financial advisors who help them do their debt issuance and bond counsel to help them through these processes. And that also typically includes considerations of diversity of suppliers for those sources. And so by allowing them to use their regular process, we are enabling a broad participation of the professionals across the country who support states, counties, and cities in doing their debt issuance, rather than us picking those vendors.
Next in queue, we have the line of Karen Leondini of Atlanta Fed. Your line is open.
Hi, thank you so much for hosting this call. I just had a simple question. I was curious if you had any plans to host a similar call-in number for the public, for those issuers that may be able to ask these kinds of questions and get any clarity beyond what's in the FAQs. And if you do decide, if that's not decided now, but you decide that at a later time, it would be great to know in advance, because that could be something that we can help promote.
As a first shot at that answer or that question, we have had ongoing discussions with the associations that many of these issuers are affiliated with. So organizations like GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, NASS, the National Association of State Treasurers, NASPO, the National Association of State Budget Officers, and other entities like that, SIFMA on the underwriter side. And the FAQs are really designed for the broadest distribution of information to the entire marketplace, including issuers large and small. I'd leave it to Michael whether we have a system for sort of having a phone call like this on a national basis or even a regional basis, and whether that might not be practical. But we are having plenty of communication with representatives of all these issuers.
And the short answer is we've contemplated doing that, but for reasons that Kent articulated earlier in the call, there are 50,000 of these entities in the country or more, and many of these issues are very idiosyncratic to the jurisdiction. There's a reason why each of them have financial advisors and bond counsels to support them working through it. And our first direction is for them to rely on those people to help them interpret these programs. But, and we are taking input. We're getting lots of questions, and we get a daily readout on the questions that come through the board and the bank's website on the facility as the first mechanisms. But I agree with your suggestion that if we do intend to host a call, we would certainly reach out to this group to give you advance awareness and invite you to join. But it's not in our first order approach to trying to deal with the individual questions.
Actually, it might be helpful to add to that in terms of the process, we would hope within, I would say the week after next, to be publishing a notice of intent, which would be the first source of information that interested issuers could submit to us that will give us an idea of what the pipeline is going to be so that we can plan accordingly. And that would be, information to confirm they're an eligible issuer, what are their borrowing needs, when do they need funding, what form of security can they offer, basic information like that would then enable us to respond to them and say, okay, you're eligible. We've approved for you to send us an application that we will review and then promptly give you an answer on. So look for that notice of intent coming out. I would hope if it's not late next week, it would be the following week. And that will clearly be an important step along the process in standing up this facility.
we have the line of David Erickson, New York Fed. The line is open.
Hi, this is a little bit out of left field, but there was a startup. I think it didn't last, but it was in San Francisco called Neighborly.com, and their motto was making bonds sexy again, and municipal bonds sexy again, and they were successful in driving down the transaction costs so they could make very small, they could do smaller transactions, and they really focused on things like microgrid for a community that wanted to switch over to renewable energy generation, or did a lot of work around broadband access in rural areas and things like that. And I'm just wondering if someone's thinking creatively about, like, is it possible to create like a bond for the performing arts organizations that don't have access to any other of the liquidity facilities, or maybe a bond that's really targeted to very small minority and women-owned businesses, or some way in which the municipal liquidity facility could help reach these hard-to-reach borrowers?
Yeah, so I'm quite familiar with Neighborly and their ambitious efforts. I haven't kept up with them in the past year or two in terms of how that's worked out. I don't see them, I haven't heard a lot about them since then, so I'm not sure how successful they were in expanding beyond the microgrid that you were talking about. I think, quite frankly, it's challenging enough to try to deal with 261 borrowers plus another maybe almost dozen multi-state entities, and that doesn't include a lot of very, very large utilities, transit systems, water and sewer systems, transportation systems who are clamoring to try to have direct access to this facility, and that we are continuing to consider. So I think the kind of creativity that you're talking about, which is no doubt important, needs to be fostered at the local level, and then find an eligible issuer that can take an interest in them and support them. I don't see a way that the Fed can foster that in the short 8 months that we've been given to provide liquidity support to state, city, and local governments. But I think that kind of creativity is allowed for in this program to the extent that there's local interest in developing it.
And one awareness to build on top of that, because I agree with Kent that kind of creativity in supporting those types of entities and issues is good. Even within the 261 issuers that we're talking about, which are the 50 states and D.C., and the largest counties and cities in this country, you can tell by the performance of the muni market that the market is having trouble wrapping its head around what are the revenue and expense impacts on these largest jurisdictions. How do we understand that, and how do we understand how to price those risks? Now, if they're struggling with that at this moment and how to think about the cash flow and liquidity needs, it's hard to imagine how that extends to small nonprofits or to other what were largely venture ideas in normal times, how the current markets would be able to support those given the uncertainties around it. And so I think Ken is exactly right. We hope that goes on at the local level, but we're focused. We expanded the number of issuers from 74 to over 261. And now we've got to figure out how to support those under the conditions of uncertainty and cash flow. And remember also that this is a liquidity program. It's not a grant program. And so we need to be careful that the lending we do or the purchasing we do actually comes as a backstop and actually comes with sufficient credit risk management, that we're not inadvertently giving grants rather than providing liquidity.
Thank you.
Next, we have the line, Stephen Whitaker, the Cleveland Fed. Your line is open.
Hi. So one of our contacts read the FAQ and sent me a couple comments and pointed out that the penalty rate and I think there's a certificate. Hello? Yeah, there's a certification.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. So one of our contacts read the FAQ and pointed out that you've got a penalty rate and a certification that you can't get financing elsewhere. And so I'm wondering how you expect the states to handle that. So say you had a city that was too small by population to access directly, and they're unable to get financing, so they approach the state, but the state is still able to get financing through regular channels. Would you expect the state to buy their notes and, try to issue into the regular market and say the purpose of this issuance is buying notes of a subdivision? Or could they come to you and say, we're doing this on behalf of a subdivision that cannot access the market?
That's an interesting question. I think the issuer is going to have to sign the certificate. These are not our rules. These are 13.3. They're in the statute. A penalty rate is part of the statute. That's the whole purpose for central bank lending in this kind of crisis environment. That it's a penalty to the normalized conditions, and that the access to capital is not that there's no access to capital, but that there's not access to sufficient capital on similar lending terms. My gut is that if the state has access to the capital markets in sufficient amounts and under reasonable credit terms, that they wouldn't need the facility, and if they are desiring to support their local issuer that may not have that access, that's what they can do in the capital markets, then they should do it. They don't need access to the Fed facility for that.
Okay. Are you aware of anyone doing that?
In either case, they would have to be putting their credit on the line, so I don't know that there's a difference between the two in terms of what their obligation would be and what the risks they would be taking on with the local issuer. Sorry, you had a follow-up?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm just wondering how, the creditors so if a state comes to the market for any of its normal purposes, which it borrows for every year, whether it would be viewed differently by the market if they come specifically for this purpose, to say, we're trying to assist.
I think
with cash flow.
Yeah, clearly, if they're taking on credit risk, and this security, whether it's bought by the Fed or in the normal market, is a liability to that entity, to the state, let's say in your example, that's going to count against their debt ratios when they go to get their ratings affirmed, and to the extent that they're over leveraging, it could impact their ratings. So that's clearly a limitation that they're going to be operating under, regardless of which execution they access the Fed window or the MLF, or if they go to the normal capital markets. But again, that's the state's issue to deal with. Our job is to make liquidity available to all the eligible issuers that the board has defined.
And with no further time for remarks, I'll go ahead and turn it back to our host for any closing remarks.
So this is Michael Strine. First of all, I'd say thank you for your time and attention today. I hope this session was helpful to you. Remember the resource MLF at ny.frb.org is available to submit additional questions, and we will circle back. We appreciate the help we know you will be providing from the contacts that you already have, and so providing us feedback or asking us additional questions or offering us help in leveraging your contacts to help explain and achieve the goals of this program is very welcome and most appreciated. So thanks for your time, thanks for your help, and keep the good questions coming. Hope everybody's doing well through all this, and look forward to seeing you all on the other side.